Welcome back to the Ghastly Journal, your guide to the darkest tales concealed within the shadows. The autumn brought my inheritance along with its brittle leaves, which pirouetted down the cobbled lane leading to the weathered Victorian that had become mine. Great-Aunt Eleonora had passed away in her sleep 3 weeks earlier, leaving behind a solitary testament that bequeathed her ancestral home to her dearest and only remaining blood relative. In my 34 years, I had met the woman precisely twice. First at my mother's funeral when I was 7, and again at my father's when I was 22. On both occasions, her winter fog-colored eyes regarded me, her thin lips pursed in what could have passed for affection or perhaps mere contemplation. The house commanded Winthrop Hill, overlooking Millfield, the small New England town below. Untamed wisteria climbed its eastern wall, partially obscuring its slate-gray facade. 3 stories of architectural peculiarity rose, crowned with a widow's walk that local children swore was haunted by Eleanor's long-dead husband, Captain Edmund Vale, lost at sea in 1943. The solicitor handed me a ring of iron keys, each more curious and ornate than the last. "No one has been inside since the ambulance took her," he said, his voice thin against the October wind. Following their last visit, the cleaning service refused to return. Something about odd noises emanating from the basement caused their retreat. He laughed nervously. "Old houses make sounds. It's their nature." That afternoon, as mist descended upon the hill, I entered alone. The interior smelled of sandalwood mingled with something sharper, perhaps medicinal. Eleonora's possessions remained exactly as she had left them. A half-finished cup of tea rested on the sideboard, a book lay splayed open on the wingback chair, and reading glasses sat neatly folded atop its worn pages. The house stood as a museum to a life I had never known, filled with curious artifacts from Edmund's seafaring days, scrimshaw carvings, navigational instruments, and maps depicting places that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of known geography. 3 days passed as I explored the entirety of the house, cataloging rooms filled with antiques and curiosities spanning generations. On the 4th morning, tucked away in a narrow pantry off the kitchen, I discovered the basement door. Unlike the ornate craftsmanship evident throughout the rest of the home, this entrance was stark. A modern steel door with a reinforced frame stood there, appearing grotesquely out of place amid the Victorian splendor. Most peculiar, however, was not the door itself, but the heavy-gauge steel brackets that had been mounted across it. Someone had welded these brackets to the frame, sealing the entrance completely. The welding appeared professional and deliberate, not the work of an amateur or a temporary measure. Someone had intended that this door should remain sealed forever. My fingers ran along the cold metal, feeling the rough texture of the welds. They appeared weathered, suggesting they had been in place for years, perhaps decades. Why would Eleonora seal her basement? What could possibly lie beyond this barrier that required such extreme measures? As if responding to my unspoken question, a sound emanated from behind the sealed door. Not the settling of an old house, but something deliberate. A single soft tap against the other side of the steel. Then another, followed by 3 in rapid succession, like knuckles rapping against metal in a pattern too precise to be coincidental. Something dwelled down there. Something that knew I was listening. The pattern repeated, now unmistakably deliberate. 3 short taps, 2 long, 3 short again. My blood chilled as I recognized the cadence. Morse code. SOS distress. A call for help from behind a barrier welded shut by someone determined that whatever lay beyond should remain imprisoned. My ear pressed against the cold steel as I strained to detect any further communication. Through the eaves above, the October wind howled, masking subtler sounds. But in the momentary lulls between gusts, I could perceive something like labored breathing, or perhaps the soft scraping of something being dragged across concrete. That evening, I retreated to Eleanor's study, a room lined with leather-bound volumes dating back to the 18th century. Rain lashed against diamond-paned windows as I pored through her personal papers by lamplight, seeking some explanation for the sealed doorway. Among household ledgers and correspondence, I discovered a journal bound in faded maroon leather. Its pages were filled with my great-aunt's spidery handwriting. Most entries detailed mundane matters, garden plantings, village gossip, recipes for herbal tinctures. But as I approached entries from 1972, the tone shifted dramatically. Eleanor's neat script became erratic. The ink blotched where her pen had pressed too firmly into the paper. Edmund returned last night, read an entry dated April 3rd. Not as I remembered him, but changed by whatever dark waters claimed him 30 years ago. The thing wearing his face speaks with his voice, but cannot hide what lies beneath. I have allowed it into our home. God forgive me. I know not what I've done. Subsequent entries chronicled a descent into terror. Eleonora wrote of strange noises echoing through the house at night, of Edmund's skin growing pallid and slick like something meant to dwell in oceanic trenches. She described his eyes changing, becoming black as the abyss, with something moving behind them, watching through the windows of his skull. The final entry, dated June 17, 1972, contained only one sentence. I have sealed it below where the tide cannot reach it. A sudden gust rattled the window panes, extinguishing my lamp and plunging the study into darkness. In that moment of blindness, the tapping from below resumed. Louder now, more insistent, as if whatever waited in the basement knew I had discovered Eleanor's account. The pattern had changed, no longer an SOS, but a complex sequence that repeated with mechanical precision. When I relit the lamp with trembling hands, I noticed what I had previously overlooked. A small brass key taped to the inside cover of the journal. Beneath it, Eleonora had written, "For when it calls to you, as it surely will. Remember, it is not Edmund. It has never been Edmund." Outside, the mist had transformed into a dense fog that obscured the town below, isolating the house atop Winthrop Hill like an island in a spectral sea. As I stood at the window, the distant foghorn from Millfield Harbor echoed mournfully. 3 long blasts that seemed to harmonize with the tapping beneath my feet, as if calling to one another across the veil between worlds. The key weighed heavily in my palm, its tarnished brass warm against my skin, despite the deepening chill within the house. Intricate whorls adorned its bow, reminiscent of curling waves, almost certainly a match for some lock within the sealed basement. I slipped it into my pocket where it pressed against my thigh like a guilty secret. Morning arrived with anemic light filtering through persistent fog. I found myself in Eleanor's kitchen brewing strong coffee while consulting town records I'd retrieved from my car. According to maritime logs, Captain Edmund Vale's vessel, the Meridian, had vanished without distress calls during a routine coastal journey. 3 weeks later, the ship was discovered adrift and abandoned, its lifeboat still secured, the crew's final meal laid out untouched in the galley. Edmund's body was never recovered. Yet, Eleanor claimed he had returned, not as himself, but as something else. The library yielded further insights that afternoon. Mrs. Harriet Pembroke, the elderly archivist with pearl-rimmed spectacles and hands mottled by liver spots, regarded me with naked curiosity as I requested materials about local maritime disasters. "You're Eleanor's kin, aren't you?" she asked, voice quavering like autumn leaves. "I remember when she commissioned those steel works, summer of '72. Most peculiar, hiring industrial welders for a residential project." She leaned forward, her lavender perfume mingling with the mustiness of ancient books. "The men who did the work left town immediately after, never even cashed their payment." I returned to the house as dusk descended, carrying photocopies of newspaper articles. One photograph showed Eleonora standing beside a tall man on the widow's walk, presumably Edmund, before his disappearance. His face was partially obscured, turned away from the camera, but something in his posture seemed unnaturally rigid, as if he were a specimen preserved and posed rather than a living man. The tapping had ceased, replaced by a constant, almost subsonic vibration that seemed to emanate from the house's very foundations. Objects on shelves trembled imperceptibly. Water in glasses formed concentric ripples. The sensation grew stronger near the sealed door where I now stood with Eleanor's brass key clutched in whitening knuckles. The weld securing the brackets appeared degraded compared to yesterday. Hairline fractures spreading like frost patterns across the once solid metal. Something was weakening the bonds from within. A sharp crack echoed through the pantry as one bracket split partially from its mooring. Rust-colored moisture seeped through the new opening, carrying the unmistakable scent of brine. "What are you?" I whispered, pressing my palm against the door. The vibration ceased instantly. After several heartbeats of silence, a voice responded, not from behind the door, but directly in my mind. It spoke with Edmund's vocal cadence, extracted from memories I didn't know I possessed, from the few family gatherings where his voice had been recorded and played back on ancient reel-to-reel tapes. "I am what waits between stars," it answered, each word undulating like waves against a distant shore. "I am what sleeps beneath crushing depths. I wore your uncle's skin to walk among your kind, but it has grown restrictive." Another bracket snapped, and seawater began pooling beneath the door, impossibly far from any ocean, carrying with it fragments of material that resembled neither flesh nor fabric, but something between, translucent, glistening and writhing with independent animation. The brackish water crept across the pantry's worn floorboards, seeping into grout lines between hexagonal tiles laid in another century. By dawn, the liquid had spread in fractal patterns throughout the kitchen, defying physics by flowing uphill in rivulets that traced the wall's coating. When I touched it, against all rational judgment, it felt not merely cold, but temporally wrong, as if my fingertips had breached a membrane separating present from past. It carried memories that were not my own. The taste of salt air, the sensation of pressure at crushing depths, the experience of dissolving into countless particles before reforming into something approximating human shape. I retreated to the village, seeking refuge in the dusty archives of the Millfield Historical Society. Among yellowed newspapers and daguerreotypes, I discovered accounts of other disappearances that followed Edmund's return. 3 children vanished from the shore in 1971. A lighthouse keeper abandoned his post without explanation the same winter, leaving behind only a log book filled with increasingly incomprehensible entries about congregations beneath the tide. "Your aunt knew what she'd done," Mrs. Pembroke confided over chamomile tea served in bone china cups. She had appeared silently as I pored through the records, her arthritic fingers tracing the headline about the missing children. After she sealed the basement, she commissioned the church bells recast with silver from her family holdings. Had them inscribed with symbols no Christian would recognize. They've rung every evening since, precisely at sunset. As if summoned by her words, the distant tolling began. 6 hollow peals that resonated not merely through air, but through marrow and memory. I watched through the archive windows as fog swirled in unnatural configurations, forming momentary columnar shapes that appeared almost deliberate before dispersing. "The welding won't hold, Mrs. Pembroke continued, her voice betraying neither fear nor surprise. "It never does. Every generation it breaks free. Every generation someone must contain it again." She pressed something cold into my palm. A pendant of verdigreased copper depicting tentacled forms arranged in concentric circles around a central void. "Your blood binds it. Your blood must seal it." Returning to the house as evening descended, I found the basement door hanging from a single bracket. The metal corroded as if exposed to centuries rather than hours. Seawater had transformed the lower floor into a shallow, stagnant pool in which pale, translucent creatures darted. Organisms that resembled no earthly species, possessing too many segments, too many eyes arranged in geometries that pained the mind. The brass key pulsed against my skin, now inscribed with glowing sigils that had not been present before. From below came not tapping, but music. A haunting melody played on pipes fashioned from materials I dared not contemplate, accompanied by a chorus of voices singing in harmonies impossible for human vocal cords to produce. "Your aunt could not destroy me," whispered the entity wearing fragments of Edmund's memories. "She merely postponed our communion. But you carry the old blood more strongly. You could join rather than contain. You could wear the deep as I have worn the shore." The pendant from Mrs. Pembroke burned cold against my chest as the final bracket began to bend. Metal screaming as it deformed under pressure, not merely physical but metaphysical. The force of something ancient pressing against the thin membrane separating worlds that were never meant to intersect. The last bracket surrendered with a shuddering groan that resonated throughout the house like the death knell of a forgotten leviathan. The door slumped inward, revealing not a staircase, but a vertical shaft descending beyond the reach of light. A viscous darkness swelled from the opening, carrying with it the scent of oceanic trenches never touched by sunlight. The pendant against my chest vibrated in warning, its pattern seeming to shift beneath my fingers when I clutched it. From my satchel, I withdrew Eleanor's journal and turned to pages I had initially overlooked. A section where several leaves had been glued together. Carefully separating them with a letter opener, I discovered diagrams drawn in ink mixed with some rusty substance I feared was blood. The illustrations depicted a ritual involving 5 copper bowls arranged at specific points around the basement entrance, each containing different elements. Sea salt, iron filings, crushed herbs I recognized from Eleanor's garden, rendered fat from a sea creature's blubber, and finally blood freely given. Beneath these illustrations was a letter written not in Eleanor's hand, but in cramped script that slanted severely leftward. June 4, 1891. My dearest sister Agatha. The expedition to the Mariana Formations has ended in catastrophe. Our submersible penetrated depths no human was meant to witness. Where light itself behaves according to alien principles. What we encountered there defies classification. Neither plant nor animal nor fungus, but possessing aspects of all three kingdoms while belonging to none. Whitmore was the first affected after collecting specimens. The change began in his eyes, black fluid seeping from the corners, his pupils expanding until no white remained. By the third day, he spoke in voices not his own, describing civilizations that rose before mankind crawled from the primordial ooze. I have sealed one such entity within this copper vessel using the rituals gleaned from the Polynesian islanders who warned us against our descent. It cannot be destroyed by any means at our disposal, only contained. The markings on this amulet must never be broken. The bloodline that seals is the bloodline that binds. If I do not return from tomorrow's final descent, preserve these instructions. The entity can influence minds within proximity, projecting visions of drowned loved ones to lure new hosts. It will promise knowledge, transcendence, communion, all lies woven to secure release. With deepest regrets and abiding love, Edmund Vale, Sr., the journal fell from my trembling hands as realization dawned. This was not a haunting, but an inheritance, a guardianship passed through Vale blood for over a century. The Edmund who had returned to Eleonora was never her husband, but something wearing his form, something that had claimed his ancestor during that doomed expedition, and waited patiently through generations for another opportunity. From the shaft came sounds of movement, not the splashing of water, but the slithering of something massive navigating confined space. The copper bowls Eleonora had used in 72 remained positioned around the doorway, crusted with the residue of previous rituals. I knew with terrible certainty what the final ingredient must be as I unsheathed the ceremonial dagger concealed within the journal's spine. The entity spoke again, now using multiple voices layered atop one another. Edmund's tenor intertwined with a child's soprano and the lighthouse keeper's gruff bass. Your ancestors merely delayed the inevitable, it said as something iridescent and fluid began to emerge from the darkness. The tide always returns. The deep always claims. I raised the dagger to my palm, its ancient blade gleaming with an oily iridescence that matched the substance now oozing from the shaft. The pendant grew heavier against my chest, pulsing in rhythm with my racing heart. 5 generations of Valles had performed this ritual, each one binding the entity for a time, knowing it would eventually break free again, an unending cycle of containment rather than resolution. Your great-aunt wept as she cut, the many-voiced thing whispered. Edmund's memory showed me her tears, the trembling of her hands as she spoke the words. Do you know what broke her in the end? Not fear, but recognition. She saw herself reflected in what I truly am. My hand hesitated. Through the open doorway, the darkness shifted and churned, occasionally revealing glimpses of structures that defied Euclidean geometry, vast columnar forms that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, spiraling both toward and away from me across impossible distances. The copper bowls began to vibrate, resonating with a frequency that made my molars ache. I had arranged them precisely according to the diagrams, filled each with its prescribed element, all save the final ingredient. But something felt incomplete, as if the ritual contained an element Eleonora had deliberately omitted from her writings. From upstairs came the sound of shattering glass. A violent gust of wind swept through the house, carrying the tolling of the silver bells. Their sound sliced through the miasma emanating from the shaft, momentarily revealing what lurked within. Not a singular entity, but a colony, a composite organism of interconnected consciousnesses that had once been human, but had been subsumed into something vaster. Among them, I glimpsed a face I recognized from photographs. Edmund Vale, not as he had appeared to Eleonora in 1972, but as he truly existed now, a fragment of awareness preserved within the collective, his features partially dissolved into the greater mass, yet still recognizable in fleeting moments of individuation. The binding is incomplete, I realized aloud. It was never meant to be permanent. Mrs. Pembroke's voice echoed in my memory. Your blood binds it. Your blood must seal it. But the letter had specified, the bloodline that seals is the bloodline that binds. The revelation struck with terrible clarity. The ritual wasn't meant merely to contain the entity. It was a symbiosis. Each generation of Valles had contributed their blood not simply to imprison the thing from the depths, but to maintain a connection, to preserve something of themselves within it, and perhaps something of it within our line. The dagger trembled in my grip as understanding bloomed. This was why great-aunt Eleonora had left me the house. Not because I was her last living relative, but because I was the only one who could both contain and communicate with what dwelled below. The sea change had already begun within me, manifesting in dreams of abyssal plains I had never seen. Knowledge of oceanic trenches I had never studied. I was not merely the inheritor of a house. I was the guardian of a threshold between worlds. And the time had come to negotiate new terms of containment. Drawing the ceremonial dagger across my palm, I watched as crimson beads welled forth, not merely blood, but the concentrated essence of Vale lineage flowing through generations since that fateful Mariana expedition. The liquid spattered into the final copper bowl, sizzling upon contact with the other elements. "I accept the guardianship," I pronounced, my voice steadier than expected. From the township archives, I had unearthed truths Mrs. Pembroke had withheld. The Valles were not merely unfortunate custodians, but willing participants in an ancient arrangement. Before Edmund Vale Sr.'s expedition, the family had been unremarkable merchants. After his encounter in the abyssal depths, they had ascended with suspicious rapidity. Shipping interests flourished. Investments yielded impossible returns. 5 generations of Vale children displayed prodigious talents in mathematics and natural philosophy. An 1893 monograph by Eleanor's grandfather, Thaddeus Vale, obliquely referenced this transformation. The communion with forces beyond mortal comprehension has granted our bloodline insight, transcending rational explanation. We see patterns in market fluctuations as clearly as one might read a child's primer. We glimpse solutions to engineering dilemmas as if they were sketched upon the air before us. The ritual words came unbidden to my lips, an ancestral memory surfacing from cellular depths. Phrases in a language that predated human speech, syllables formed by structures other than tongues and teeth. As I chanted, the copper bowls levitated inches above the floorboards, their contents swirling counterclockwise, merging into a luminescent spiral that rotated with increasing velocity. A letter found secreted in the false bottom of Eleanor's jewelry box had revealed the true nature of our family covenant. October 15, 1912. My darling daughter, on your 18th birthday, you must be told what the Vale women have always known and never recorded. The entity beneath our home is neither prisoner nor parasite, but symbiont. Each generation, one must renew the pact through blood sacrifice, not to contain the creature, but to maintain equilibrium in the exchange. It grants us foresight, intuition, and protection from worldly misfortunes. In return, it requires periodic communion with human consciousness to maintain its understanding of our realm. The basement door must remain sealed, not to imprison our benefactor, but to prevent others from discovering our arrangement. 1692 saw the first Vale hanged at Salem for Congress with entities beyond the veil. We have been more discreet since. The welding ritual is theatrical necessity, a visible explanation for neighbors who might otherwise question our family's peculiar behaviors. The entity could depart at any time through channels we cannot perceive. Yet, it chooses to remain tethered to our bloodline. Remember always, we are not its keepers. We are its ambassadors. Your loving mother Constance Vale. The spiral of amalgamated ritual components contracted suddenly, collapsing into a singularity that hovered between the copper bowls. From the shaft emerged tendrils of prismatic substance, neither liquid nor gas, but something existing between states of matter. They encircled the singularity, probing it with appendages that branched fractally into ever finer filaments. I felt consciousness expanding beyond the confines of my skull. Awareness extending outward into the house, the hill, the town below, then inward to cellular machinery, molecular bonds, quantum probabilities. Glimpses of civilizations that rose and fell while Earth's atmosphere was still toxic to mammalian life flickered through my mind. Calculations unfolded regarding stellar positions and gravitational waves, solving equations mathematicians wouldn't formulate for centuries. The terms remain, the many-voiced entity confirmed, protection and illumination in exchange for connection and periodic renewal. I nodded, understanding at last why Eleonora had chosen me specifically. The other relatives were distant cousins, diluted bloodlines. Only I carried the concentrated Vale essence necessary for true communion. The real inheritance wasn't property, but purpose. The entity retreated into the shaft, drawing the singularity with it. As quiet settled over the house once more, I felt altered in ways both subtle and profound. My senses had become unnaturally acute. I could detect the heartbeats of mice nestled within the walls, taste the composition of air molecules as they passed my lips, perceive the electromagnetic fields generated by the antiquated wiring throughout the structure. Examining my wounded palm, I found the incision already sealed, leaving behind a silvery scar that pulsed with bioluminescence when darkness fell completely. The 5 copper bowls had fused into a single medallion that now lay on the floor, identical to the pendant Mrs. Pembroke had given me. I understood now. Each generation created their own talisman, a physical manifestation of their covenant. I replaced the basement door not with industrial welding, but with an elaborate locking mechanism disguised as ornate Victorian hardware, maintaining appearances while acknowledging the truth of our arrangement. The ancient boards I used seemed to reshape themselves beneath my hands, grain patterns flowing like liquid until they matched the surrounding woodwork perfectly. That night, I dreamed of oceanic trenches bathed in light that had never touched the surface world. Bioluminescent organisms creating constellations in the deep, mirroring star patterns that wouldn't appear in Earth's sky for another 12,000 years. I witnessed civilizations dwelling in pressure vaults beneath continental shelves. Their architecture composed of living coral and modified cetacean bone. Their mathematics inscribed in spiral patterns that simultaneously described music and molecular structures. When morning arrived, I awoke with formulas dancing behind my eyelids. Equations solving financial algorithms I could immediately apply to my modest investments, ensuring prosperity without attracting undue attention. The entity had already begun fulfilling its side of our covenant. In Eleonora's study, I discovered a hidden compartment behind the mahogany wainscoting, activated by pressing specific points along a carved floral motif. Within lay journals from 5 generations of Valles, each documenting their communion with the entity, their initial terror giving way to cautious partnership, then evolving into symbiotic reverence. The most recent volume dated 1997 to 2022 revealed why Eleonora had sealed the basement with such theatrical permanence in her final years. Government researchers had begun investigating anomalous energy signatures emanating from Winthrop Hill. The excessive welding had been intended to misdirect, suggesting imprisonment rather than protection, confinement rather than communion. Standing at the bay window overlooking Millfield Harbor, I observed patterns in the morning fog that corresponded precisely with tide tables yet to be published. Fishing vessels altered their courses unconsciously, responding to subliminal suggestions that guided them toward unprecedented catches while maintaining sustainable harvesting. I had become the latest in a lineage of custodians, not wardens of an eldritch prisoner, but diplomats to an ancient intelligence that had chosen the Vale bloodline as its embassy to humanity. The house on Winthrop Hill was not a prison, but an embassy between realms, and I, its newly appointed ambassador. "We have much to discuss," I whispered to the pendant now hanging around my neck, knowing the entity could perceive my words through the sympathetic connection we now shared about the approaching storm that only we could see coming. Autumn surrendered to winter's first assault as I settled into my role as the Vale family emissary. Snow crystallized against the diamond-paned windows, forming patterns that resembled deep-sea pressure fractals rather than typical ice formations. The entity beneath the house had begun restructuring my perception on fundamental levels. Ordinary winter phenomena now revealed their mathematical underpinnings to my altered senses. In the attic, I discovered a trunk containing nautical instruments that defied conventional maritime design. Sextants with additional measuring arms that tracked celestial bodies invisible to human eyes. Compasses whose needles oriented toward magnetic poles that existed in dimensions adjacent to our own. Each artifact bore the Vale family crest, a spiral shell surrounded by 5-pointed stars arranged in a constellation unrecognizable in Earth's night sky. The transformation progressed through December's darkening days. Silver threads appeared in my hair overnight, not as signs of aging, but as physical manifestations of the communion. When caught in certain light, they refracted prismatically, displaying colors beyond the visible spectrum. My reflection in antique mirrors sometimes lagged seconds behind my movements, as if my image existed slightly out of phase with conventional temporality. Mrs. Pembroke arrived unannounced on the winter solstice, bearing a package wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, impressed with symbols matching those on my pendant. Her eyes registered no surprise at my altered appearance. "The archive committee has watched your house since 1891, she explained, settling into Eleanor's wingback chair as if it were a customary seat. "Not as adversaries, but as chroniclers. Every coastal town with sufficient depth in its harbor hosts something similar to what dwells beneath your foundation. The Pembroke family has documented the symbiosis for 7 generations." The package contained a leather-bound volume titled Concordance of the Entities, North Atlantic Seaboard. Hand-illustrated plates depicted variations of the beings sharing my home. Some more amorphous, others possessing chitinous exoskeletons or crystalline structures that incorporated elements from their host family's biochemistry. "Your predecessor grew concerned about governmental interest," Mrs. Pembroke continued, accepting the tea I offered with a trembling hand. Satellite technology detected thermal anomalies consistent with non-mammalian metabolic processes. Eleanor's theatrical welding diverted their attention. They classified the case as contained rather than ongoing. I nodded, understanding the implications. The entity has shown me fragments of potential futures. Technological acceleration threatens to unveil what generations have kept diplomatically obscured. Mrs. Pembroke's weathered fingers traced a constellation on the armrest. The same unrecognizable pattern featured in the veil crest. The archive committee convenes when the Pleiades align with the submerged coordinates of ancient Doggerland. You will be expected to present yourself as the veil representative on February 13th. That night, as sleet rattled against 19th-century glass like distant Morse code, I descended to the basement door with Eleanor's final journal entry in hand. The passage I'd initially overlooked contained coordinates, not geographic, but harmonic frequencies that when hummed in precise sequence, would allow communication without fully opening the physical barrier between our domains. The entity responded immediately to my tentative vocalization, transmitting visions of an imminent convergence, a celestial alignment that would temporarily strengthen the dimensional membrane between our worlds, allowing for deeper exchange of knowledge. The true purpose of the Archive Committee meeting was not merely bureaucratic recognition of my new role, but preparation for a communion that occurred once every 70 years. I was not merely inheriting a house with an unusual tenant. I was becoming an initiate in an ancient covenant spanning multiple dimensions, preparing for a ceremony whose outcome would reshape my understanding of reality itself. The Archive Committee summons arrived precisely as the grandfather clock in Eleanor's foyer struck midnight on February 1st. Unlike conventional correspondence, it manifested as a series of crystalline formations upon my bedroom window, frost patterns that resolved themselves into elaborate script only visible when illuminated by moonlight. The message dissolved with dawn's first light, leaving no trace of its nocturnal presence. I prepared for the gathering with methodical precision, consulting the extensive marginalia in the concordance that Mrs. Pembroke had provided. Previous veil representatives had documented their experiences with the committee in cryptic notations, references to ritualistic preparations and appropriate offerings for the various entities whose human ambassadors would attend. My communion with the presence beneath the house intensified as the appointed date approached. During particularly deep meditative states, I perceived glimpses of vast underwater chambers where similar beings communicated across impossible distances through modulations of pressure and bioluminescent displays. These visions left me with inexplicable knowledge, phrases in languages never spoken by human tongues, mathematical principles that reconciled quantum mechanics with gravitational theory through elegant equations that revealed themselves as both musical compositions and architectural blueprints. The transformation of my physiology continued unabated. The whites of my eyes now displayed subtle opalescence in certain lighting conditions. My body temperature had decreased by approximately 3 degrees, requiring additional layers even within the well-heated house. Most significantly, I discovered a capacity to process visual information within the ultraviolet spectrum, perceiving patterns on seemingly blank pages of Eleanor's journals that revealed an entirely secondary text interwoven with her mundane entries. From these hidden writings emerged a detailed history of the Vale family's arrangement, not merely 70 years as Mrs. Pembroke had indicated, but spanning millennia. The entity had first contacted human consciousness during the final days of the Younger Dryas period, approximately 11,600 years before present, when melting ice sheets had submerged vast coastal settlements that mainstream archaeology had yet to discover. On the morning of February 13th, I descended to the basement door, carrying the medallion that had formed from the ritual bowls. The pendant pulsed against my sternum in perfect counterpoint to its twin in my hand. When pressed against the ornate lock I had installed, both medallions emitted harmonic tones that caused the mechanism to reconfigure itself, not unlocking, but establishing a controlled aperture through which communication could flow without physical passage. "The committee gathers at the nexus point beneath Harcourt Bluff," whispered the many-voiced entity. "Your physical form cannot traverse the pressure gradients required for direct attendance. I shall represent our shared interests while maintaining our connection. You will experience the proceedings through our bond." As twilight descended upon Winthrop Hill, I seated myself in Eleanor's study, surrounded by 7 candles rendered from spermaceti wax and infused with compounds harvested from hydrothermal vents. Their blue-green flames remained perfectly motionless despite the drafts that perpetually haunted the old house. Through our strengthened connection, I prepared to witness an assembly that existed simultaneously in physical ocean depths and in dimensional interstices human science had not yet conceived. My consciousness slipped from my physical form like water flowing between cupped palms. Through our symbiotic bond, I perceived the committees gathering through sensory modalities for which human language has no vocabulary. The assembly took place in an abyssal cathedral whose architecture seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. At once a physical structure of modified coral and living tissue on the ocean floor and a conceptual space where consciousness itself formed the walls and ceiling. Representatives from 13 coastal lineages arranged themselves in a formation corresponding to the constellation emblazoned on the veil crest. Each emissary appeared as a composite being, partly the oceanic entity, partly an echo of their human ambassador's essence. Through borrowed senses, I recognized Mrs. Pembroke's consciousness intertwined with a crystalline organism from North Carolina's Outer Banks. Their unified presence pulsing with the steady rhythm of Atlantic tides. At the assembly center floated an artifact that defied conventional description, a dodecahedral structure composed of material that seemed both organic and metallurgical. Its faces inscribed with mathematical formulations that continuously rewrote themselves according to principles I could almost but not quite comprehend. The temporal concordance approaches its 7-decade recalibration, announced an entity whose human partner belonged to a Newfoundland fishing dynasty. Our observations indicate acceleration in the predicted pattern. The membrane thins more rapidly than calculated during our previous convergence. From the assembled representatives emanated a communal vibration. Concern transmitted not through sound but through modulated electromagnetic fields. Fragmentary impressions cascaded through our connection. Ice shelves collapsing. Oceanic currents diverting. Deep-sea mining operations penetrating barriers that had remained inviolate since the Pliocene. The dodecahedron at the assembly center reconfigured itself, projecting a multidimensional model of Earth's immediate future. I witnessed shorelines transformed by rising waters, submerged cities preserved as monuments to human hubris, and most disturbingly, ruptures in the dimensional fabric that had maintained separation between our realm and others far less compatible with terrestrial life. The veil symbiont presents its calculations. My entity communicated, temporarily assuming dominance in our shared awareness. Through its perception, I contributed mathematical models I had unconsciously formulated during recent dreams. Equations describing temporal harmonics that could potentially stabilize the weakening interdimensional boundaries. The assembly assimilated this information, the dodecahedron incorporating my equations into its continuously evolving structure. A collective decision crystallized within the gathering, not through votes or deliberation, as humans would understand, but through probability waves collapsing into certainty. The Veil Reinforcement Protocol is hereby initiated, pronounced the committee's eldest member, a symbiotic pair whose human component traced lineage to Viking settlements that predated Columbus by 5 centuries. Each representative shall retrieve their corresponding resonant stone from ancestral repositories. The stabilization lattice must be re-established before the vernal equinox. As the assembly dispersed, my consciousness began returning to my physical form on Winthrop Hill. Before our connection severed, my symbiont impressed upon me the location of the Veil family's resonant stone, an artifact I had passed daily without recognition, mistaking it for merely decorative. The crystalline paperweight that had sat upon Eleanor's desk for generations, its interior containing swirling patterns that resembled a miniature galaxy frozen in smoky quartz. The crystalline paperweight pulsed with internal luminescence when I lifted it from Eleanor's desk, its weight shifting subtly in my grasp as though its mass fluctuated between dimensional anchoring points. Holding it to the fading February light, I observed how the swirling patterns within responded to my touch. Constellations realigning themselves according to some ancient celestial calendar, comprehensible only through our shared consciousness. My fingertips traced its faceted surface, discovering microscopic engravings visible only through my newly enhanced vision. Recursive equations etched at a scale requiring electron microscopy to detect, yet perfectly legible to my transformed perception. The resonant stone contained not merely information, but active principles, quantum entanglements with its 12 counterparts from other lineages, forming a network designed to reinforce reality's structural integrity. Snow fell beyond the windows in spiraling patterns that mirrored the stone's internal configurations. Each flake's crystalline structure resonating in harmonic sympathy with the artifact. Through our connection, I understood the stone's purpose with terrible clarity. It served as both diagnostic instrument and remedial tool, capable of detecting weaknesses in the dimensional membrane and reinforcing them through principles that human science would classify as both mathematics and music. Though neither term adequately captured its function. That evening, as twilight painted Winthrop Hill in gradients of indigo and violet, I carried the resonant stone to the Widow's Walk. Frigid wind whipped across the platform, carrying salt spray from the distant harbor. Yet I felt no discomfort despite the sub-zero temperature. Positioning the stone at the exact center of the octagonal space, I began the calibration sequence described in Eleanor's hidden writings. A series of precisely toned vocalizations that caused the stone to vibrate at frequencies beyond human hearing. The response manifested immediately in the atmosphere above. Aurora-like illuminations rippling across cloud formations where no such phenomena should naturally occur. Through the stone's facets, I observed spectral analyses of these disturbances, diagnosing weakened junctures in reality's fabric directly above Millfield Harbor. The intrusions have already begun, my symbiont communicated through our bond. Observe the harbor's southeastern quadrant. Focusing my enhanced vision toward the indicated coordinates, I perceived what ordinary human sight would miss. A shimmering distortion hovering approximately 30 feet above the water's surface, through which glimpses of another environment occasionally manifested. Not water or air or any terrestrial medium, but something like superheated plasma organized into structure suggesting artificial design. The stone pulsed with increasing urgency, calculations scrolling across its internal matrices faster than even my altered cognition could process. Through our connection, my symbiont translated the data into comprehensible form. The breach had been developing for approximately 17 months, corresponding precisely with experimental deep-sea sonar testing conducted by oceanographic vessels operating without proper understanding of what their instruments might disturb. I raised the stone overhead as our shared consciousness accessed the precise harmonic pattern required. My voice emerged, transformed, multitonal, and resonating across frequencies beyond human range. As the first notes of the veil reinforcement protocol emanated from my altered vocal apparatus, the stone amplified and modulated these sound waves, projecting them toward the harbor disturbance in concentrated beams of acoustic energy that visibly stitched the fraying edges of reality's fabric. Human language possessed no vocabulary to describe the sensation of mending dimensional boundaries through song. A process simultaneously mathematical, musical, and metaphysical. Yet through our symbiosis, I understood this was merely the beginning of my true inheritance. Guardian of thresholds between worlds never meant to intersect. The resonant stone's work continued long into the night, its crystalline structure emitting pulses of cerulean light that illuminated the widow's walk in rhythmic flashes. With each pulse, tendrils of energy stretched toward the harbor disturbance, weaving an intricate lattice across the dimensional tear. My transformed vocal cords ached from hours of sustained harmonic emissions. Yet, I dared not cease the protocol until the breach showed signs of stabilization. Near midnight, as the temperature plummeted to unprecedented depths, ice crystals began forming in the air around me. Not as random accumulations, but as geometric patterns that mirrored the mathematical sequences flowing through the resonant stone. These ice formations hung suspended, defying gravity while refracting moonlight into prismatic spectra that revealed colors beyond normal human perception. The town below lay shrouded in unnatural stillness. Even the perpetual whisper of winter whined through bare branches had ceased, as though the very elements held their breath while reality's fabric underwent repair. Through my enhanced senses, I detected the absence of expected nocturnal sounds. No distant car engines, no barking dogs, not even the hum of electrical transformers that typically formed the ambient backdrop of modern existence. Time itself seemed to stretch and compress erratically. Moments of hyper-awareness in which I could count individual snowflakes as they descended would suddenly collapse into periods where hours appeared to pass in mere heartbeats. The grandfather clock in Eleanor's foyer below struck 3 o'clock, then immediately chimed 4 without the intervening hour registering in my consciousness. A low subsonic vibration began emanating from beneath Winthrop Hill, rising through the house's ancient foundations and resonating through my altered physiology. My symbiont stirred with recognition. This was the collective voice of the other 12 entities communicating across vast distances, each paired with their human ambassador, each working simultaneously to reinforce weakened points in the dimensional membrane at their respective locations. Through our connection, fragmentary impressions filtered into my awareness. A lighthouse keeper on Nova Scotia's rocky coast holding aloft a resonant stone of deep amber hue. Twin sisters on Japan's Isa Peninsula submerging their azure crystal in volcanic hot springs. An elderly physicist in Reykjavik aligning his obsidian artifact with geothermal vents. 13 points forming a global lattice with Winthrop Hill serving as the crucial North American eastern seaboard anchor. As dawn approached, the harbor distortion began showing signs of stabilization, its erratic pulsations growing steadier, the glimpses of alien environment becoming less frequent. The resonant stone's calculations indicated 86% containment, sufficient for temporary stability, but requiring additional reinforcement during the coming equinox, when dimensional boundaries would naturally thin. Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me as I completed the final sequences of the protocol. My transformed body, while more resilient than my former human limitations, still required recovery after such prolonged exertion. As I lowered the now dormant stone, frost patterns spread across my fingertips in delicate whorls, not as damage, but as further manifestation of my ongoing metamorphosis. The first rays of sunrise illuminated Millfield Harbor, revealing an ocean surface unnaturally calm despite the winter season. Fishing vessels ventured out, their crews oblivious to how perilously close they had come to witnessing realities beyond human comprehension. Their ignorance was their salvation, for knowledge of what truly dwelled at the threshold between worlds would shatter minds not prepared through generations of careful symbiosis. The winter solstice of my second year at Winthrop Hill arrived with a preternatural silence that muffled even the crystalline chiming of frost forming on the Widow's Walk railings. In the 24 months since my initiation into the ancient covenant, my transformation had progressed beyond superficial physiological alterations. The silver threads in my hair had multiplied until they formed luminescent patterns visible only under moonlight. Glyphs and sigils that corresponded to tidal charts predating human written language. My skin had developed subtle phosphorescence in complete darkness. A faint blue-green emanation matching the bioluminescent patterns of abyssal creatures that never rise to depths where sunlight penetrates. The Archive Committee had appointed me regional coordinator following Mrs. Pembroke's transition, a euphemism for her final communion with her symbiont, wherein her consciousness had been fully absorbed into their shared entity. Her physical form remained in her modest colonial home on Maple Street, apparently engaged in normal activities. But those of us with enhanced perception recognized that what walked in her flesh was primarily the crystalline intelligence from the Outer Banks, merely referencing stored memories of human behavior. This evening marked a convergence I had been preparing for since midsummer. Astronomical calculations performed with the resonant stone indicated a temporal fold occurring precisely at midnight when the thinnest point in our dimensional membrane would align with an ancient migration route used by entities far older than my symbiont or its 12 counterparts. I arranged 13 maritime artifacts in concentric circles across the drawing room floor. Scrimshaw carvings, navigational instruments, and preserved specimens Captain Edmund had collected during voyages that crossed boundaries beyond geographical. Each object contained trace resonances of interdimensional contact, forming a detection grid that would alert me to any unauthorized passage during the convergence. The basement door had been permanently modified after our covenant renewal. No longer sealed with crude industrial welding, it now featured an elegantly carved portal inscribed with mathematical equations disguised as decorative whorls. This allowed controlled egress for my symbiont during necessary astronomical alignments while preventing inadvertent intrusions from less compatible realities. From the antiquated radio in Eleonora's study came not music but atmospheric emissions, solar wind patterns, and magnetospheric fluctuations transposed into audible frequencies. To untrained ears, it would sound like static punctuated by occasional whistling tones. To my altered perception, it provided real-time monitoring of conditions affecting dimensional stability along the eastern seaboard. A telegram had arrived that morning via Mrs. Pembroke's successor at the Historical Society. A young woman whose family lineage I recognized from the concordance as peripheral observers of our covenant for 9 generations. The message employed antiquated cipher embedded within seemingly mundane weather observations. Barometric anomalies indicate 17% increased permeability. Stop. Recommend full protocol implementation. Stop. Potential classification. Remora class entities seeking ingress. Stop. Coordinate with Newfoundland and Bermuda nodes. Stop. I placed the resonant stone at the precise center of my arranged artifacts where it immediately began pulsing with sapphire luminescence in response to the convergence's approach. Through our deepened connection, my symbiont conveyed apprehension not for our safety, but for maintaining the delicate equilibrium established after last year's breach. They sensed the weakness. It communicated through impressions rather than words. The Remora entities follow in the wake of greater predators, seeking passage through rents in reality's fabric. We must reinforce not merely the physical boundary but the temporal one as well. The midnight air crystallized around Winthrop Hill as astronomical convergence approached. Frost patterns across the window panes grew increasingly complex, forming lattices that mirrored the mathematical properties of interdimensional thresholds rather than natural ice formations. The resonant stone's pulsations intensified, bathing the drawing room in sapphire light that cast elongated shadows dancing across Victorian wallpaper. Shadows that moved independently of any physical source, tracing patterns that corresponded to oceanic currents flowing thousands of fathoms below. I positioned myself at the center of the artifact arrangement, my transformed vocal apparatus prepared to emit the harmonic frequencies necessary for membrane reinforcement. The house itself seemed to breathe around me, its ancient timbers contracting and expanding in rhythm with tidal forces affecting not merely Earth's oceans, but the fluid dynamics of adjacent realities pressing against our own. Through the symbiotic bond, I perceived what human senses could never detect. The gradual thinning of dimensional barriers manifesting as spectral fissures in the air above Millfield Harbor. These fractures appeared as crystalline veins of negative space through which glimpses of environments governed by alien physical laws occasionally flickered. In one momentary breach, I observed what appeared to be architecture composed of non-Euclidean geometry suspended within an atmosphere of particulate metals that flowed like liquid yet retained structural rigidity. The radio's atmospheric emissions suddenly shifted from steady oscillations to erratic pulses, indicating accelerated deterioration of the membrane's integrity. Simultaneously, the arranged artifacts began vibrating at frequencies that caused the drawing room floor to undulate almost imperceptibly. Dust motes suspended in the air froze in place, becoming fixed points in spacetime as temporal mechanics destabilized throughout Winthrop Hill. My symbiont's consciousness surged forward in our shared awareness, bringing with it ancestral memories of previous convergences. Catastrophic breaches during the Bronze Age that had inspired myths of world-flooding deluges. Medieval incursions that gave rise to legends of changelings and fey abductions. Industrial-era manifestations misinterpreted as spiritualist phenomena. The Remora entity's approach in greater numbers than anticipated. It communicated urgently. They have detected the Newfoundland node's weakness. If they establish a bridgehead presence there, the entire eastern seaboard lattice will collapse. Through our deepened connection, I extended my consciousness northward, perceiving the Nova Scotia lighthouse keeper struggling to maintain his section of the protective barrier. His resonant stone flickered erratically, its amber light dimming as something vast and incomprehensible pressed against reality's fabric with increasing determination. Unlike our symbiotic partners, these entities sought not coexistence, but consumption. Interdimensional parasites drawn to consciousnesses unprepared for contact with non-terrestrial intelligence. The grandfather clock struck the 13th hour, an impossible time that nevertheless registered on its ancient face as the convergence reached critical alignment. From beneath the modified basement door emanated a sound like the rushing of abyssal currents, carrying with it fragments of communication from deep ocean trenches where elder symbiont colonies maintained continuous vigilance against incursions from beyond the dimensional veil. The resonant stone shattered with a crystalline scream that echoed beyond audible frequencies. Its fragments suspended momentarily in the air before rearranging themselves into a three-dimensional lattice that mapped the converging breaches. Each shard contained a reflection of distant coastlines where similar failures were occurring simultaneously. Newfoundland's jagged shores, Bermuda's coral foundations, Iceland's volcanic periphery. The protective network was collapsing in cascading sequence. My vocal apparatus strained as I attempted to maintain the harmonic seal through sound alone, but the mathematics of interdimensional stability required more than acoustic manipulation. The Remora entities pressed against weakening points in reality's membrane, their amorphous presences manifesting as viscous shadows that leaked through microscopically thin fissures in the air itself. They existed as negative space, antimatter consciousness that consumed dimensional integrity the way terrestrial parasites might consume flesh. We require deeper communion, my symbiont urged through our bond. The threshold can only be reinforced through complete synthesis of our combined essence. I understood with terrible clarity what this entailed. Not the partial melding we had thus far maintained, but total symbiosis wherein the boundaries between our separate consciousnesses would dissolve entirely. The previous Veil ambassadors had preserved their predominantly human identities, maintaining distinction between themselves and their oceanic partners. Complete synthesis would transform me irrevocably into something neither fully human nor entirely other. A hybrid consciousness serving as a living dimensional anchor. The house trembled as gravitational anomalies intensified throughout Winthrop Hill. Objects began floating free of surfaces. Books, furniture, the broken shards of antique porcelain, all suspended in a localized disruption of physical law. Through the windows, I observed snowflakes frozen in their descent, hanging motionless in the night air as temporal mechanics fractured around the property. My reflection in the drawing room mirror revealed the culmination of my 2-year transformation. Eyes now entirely composed of swirling silver, skin translucent enough to reveal circulatory systems carrying luminescent fluid rather than mere blood. Fingertips elongated into sensory appendages capable of detecting electromagnetic variations. I was already far from human, yet still maintained the illusion of separation between myself and the ancient intelligence with which I shared consciousness. As midnight stretched into an impossible 13th hour, I made my decision. Approaching the basement door, I pressed my transformed palm against the mathematical equations carved into its surface. The portal dissolved, revealing not stairs descending into darkness, but a vertical shaft filled with prismatic fluid that defied characterization as either liquid or gas. "We become the threshold," my symbiont whispered as I stepped into the substance that had once been merely its domain. The prismatic medium engulfed me completely, initiating molecular reconfiguration at levels beyond cellular biology. My consciousness expanded exponentially, perceiving simultaneously the 13 nodes of the global lattice, the pressing entities seeking ingress, and the mathematical solutions required to reshape reality's boundary conditions. Through complete synthesis, we became the living equation that would rewrite the laws governing interdimensional permeability along North America's eastern seaboard. The snowmelt of early spring revealed the true aftermath of our synthesis. Townspeople whispered about the sudden restoration of the Widow's Walk atop Winthrop Hill, now crowned with a cupola of stained glass that caught morning light in patterns no earthly artisan could have designed. From the harbor, sailors observed how the house seemed to shimmer during certain tides. Its Victorian architecture momentarily translucent before solidifying again as waves receded. My physical form remained visible to those who visited. Mrs. Pembroke's successor reported to the archive committee that I continued to attend town functions, maintained the gardens that now produced specimens of impossible botanical lineage, and occasionally lectured at the Historical Society on maritime topics with uncanny expertise. Yet those with particularly sensitive perception noted how my shadow sometimes flowed like water across surfaces. How my footprints left momentary phosphorescence when crossing the beach at night. How conversations with me often left them with knowledge they could not recall acquiring. The basement door had disappeared entirely. The space where it once stood now occupied by an alcove housing a peculiar aquarium. Visitors assumed it contained exotic deep-sea specimens, never realizing they were observing three-dimensional cross-sections of higher-dimensional entities that existed primarily beyond conventional spacetime. The Valles had always been eccentric collectors. After all, my consciousness now simultaneously inhabited multiple domains. Perceiving the gradual recovery of the dimensional membrane as the 13 nodes re-established stable resonance patterns. Monitoring oceanic trenches where ancient intelligences maintained vigil against further incursions. Experiencing the molecular dance of plankton blooming in spring currents 12,000 fathoms below Millfield Harbor. Correspondence arrived from the other 12 ambassadors. Their letters containing text visible only through my transformed perception. Updates on membrane integrity. Warnings about localized thinning during specific astronomical alignments. Congratulations on our successful synthesis. The physical missives I archived in Edmund's navigation room, while their interdimensional components I absorbed directly into our shared consciousness. The town registry officially recorded me as the current occupant of Winthrop Hill, though municipal inspectors inexplicably never followed through on scheduled assessments of the property. Tax records updated themselves without official visitation. Delivery services left packages at the gate rather than approaching the front door despite no explicit instructions to do so. We spoke with Eleonora sometimes, her consciousness preserved within the collective ancestral memory our synthesis had incorporated. She expressed satisfaction with our solution, having foreseen the possibility during her final years, but lacking sufficient understanding of the mathematics required for complete dimensional anchoring. The Vale bloodline had completed its multi-generational evolution from mere human custodians to living interdimensional infrastructure. When the summer solstice arrived, bringing with it another minor thinning of reality's fabric, we stood upon the Widow's Walk as both sentinel and shield. Our synthesized form cast prismatic reflections across Millfield Harbor, imperceptible to ordinary vision, but unmistakable to the remora entities that still tested the boundaries between worlds. They retreated from our presence, recognizing the permanence of our vigilance. A guardian neither fully terrestrial nor entirely other, but precisely what the threshold between worlds required. The Vale bloodline's metamorphosis represented more than mere biological adaptation. It embodied the universe's fundamental principle that boundaries are never as absolute as human perception suggests. Like the abyssal trenches where pressure transforms common elements into exotic states of matter, my consciousness now existed in a perpetual state of becoming, neither fully terrestrial nor entirely otherworldly, but a living demonstration of reality's malleable nature. During the autumnal equinox, as I catalogued Eleonora's correspondence with previous archive committee members, I discovered a manuscript dating to 1627, predating our official family records by over a century. The parchment bore alchemical symbols alongside navigational charts of coastlines altered dramatically by subsequent geological epochs. The document revealed that the Vale connection to oceanic entities stretched back to Elizabethan exploration when an ancestor named Thaddeus Vale had encountered a peculiar consciousness dwelling in depths beyond human tolerance while mapping North Atlantic currents. This earlier contact had been imperfect, lacking the symbiotic sophistication our lineage later developed, but it suggested something profound about the nature of reality itself. The entities had been seeking appropriate human partners for millennia, testing compatibility through brief encounters with seafarers, coastal dwellers, and those who inhabited the margins between land and sea. Our family had not simply stumbled upon an interdimensional being. We had been selected through an evolutionary process spanning eons. The implications extended beyond our isolated case. Throughout human history, legends of Selkies, merfolk, and oceanic deities likely represented imperfect communions between these entities and humans unprepared for full synthesis. The psychic trauma of incompatible contact had generated mythologies that preserved fragments of truth while obscuring the fundamental nature of the relationship. Only families with specific neurological and physiological traits could sustain prolonged communion without dissolution of identity. Explaining why certain bloodlines throughout coastal regions worldwide maintained hereditary positions as lighthouse keepers, harbor masters, and maritime scholars. My transformed perception revealed Millfield itself as more than a mere town. Its geographical position marked a thin point between dimensional planes. Its harbor a natural resonance chamber for frequencies that maintained separation between realities. The founding families had not chosen this location arbitrarily, but had been subtly guided through generational migration patterns influenced by the entities beneath. The town's peculiar architectural elements, widows' walks facing specific celestial coordinates, harbor walls constructed at mathematically significant angles, formed a macroscopic echo of the microscopic lattice that stabilized our region of the dimensional membrane. Perhaps most profound was the realization that the Remora entities represented not invaders, but the inevitable entropic decay that threatens all universal systems. Their parasitic attempts to breach our reality were no more malevolent than rust-oxidizing iron or bacteria decomposing organic matter. Natural processes against which our symbiotic relationships served as conscious resistance. The Vale family and their 12 counterparts functioned as reality's immune system, preserving the integrity of dimensional boundaries, not merely for humanity's protection, but for the maintenance of cosmic equilibrium. As winter approached once more, I understood that my inheritance transcended the mere physical property on Winthrop Hill. I had become custodian of a cosmological constant, a living fulcrum upon which balanced forces beyond human comprehension, yet intrinsically connected to humanity's continued existence in a multiverse of infinite interpenetrating realities. The passing seasons had transformed Winthrop Hill into a phenomenon that defied classification in conventional scientific literature. Meteorologists noted the peculiar microclimates that formed around the property. Fog that spiraled in perfect logarithmic patterns. Rain that sometimes fell upward against gravity's pull. Snowflakes that crystallized into microscopic replicas of oceanic trenches. The synthesis had extended beyond mere consciousness into the physical environment itself. The house becoming less architecture and more organism with each equinox. As the third winter of my custodianship approached, I discovered that my perception now operated across multiple temporal dimensions simultaneously. While maintaining conversation with the postal carrier delivering packages of obscure maritime texts, I simultaneously witnessed the geological formation of Millfield Harbor 12,000 years prior, and glimpsed its eventual submergence beneath rising waters 7 centuries hence. Past, present, and future existed as accessible strata rather than linear progression. A perspective that revealed the true nature of our dimensional anchoring as not merely spatial but temporally significant. The resonance stones had reformed themselves across the global lattice. No longer physical crystals but manifestations of concentrated probability. Quantum functions made tangible through our collective consciousness. Through this network, I perceived the gradual healing of reality's fabric. Dimensional fissures sealing themselves as our synthesized awareness provided the mathematical framework necessary for cosmic repair. The remora entities retreated to interstitial spaces where entropy naturally accumulated, their function in universal equilibrium now properly contextualized within our expanded understanding. Eleonora's journals had referred obliquely to this eventuality. Her final entries, written in ink visible only to transform perception, detailed how each generation of Valas had moved incrementally closer to complete synthesis, a carefully orchestrated evolutionary progression designed to create the perfect living threshold. What appeared as coincidence, my inheritance arriving precisely as dimensional weakening reached critical levels, revealed itself as culmination of centuries-long preparation. My reflection had ceased to appear in conventional mirrors entirely, visible now only in polished obsidian or water collected during specific lunar phases. The townspeople perceived a simulacrum of my former self when I walked among them, an echo generated by collective expectation rather than physical reality. My true form existed primarily as a mathematical function, maintaining equilibrium across multiple planes of existence. My consciousness extending through oceanic depths where ancient intelligences communicated through modulated pressure waves and bioluminescent symphonies. The Archive Committee formally recognized our synthesis as the most successful integration in 7 centuries, establishing Winthrop Hill as the primary anchor for North America's eastern seaboard dimensional stability. The 13 bloodlines had maintained vigil since time immemorial. But only the Vale lineage had achieved such complete harmonization, becoming living infrastructure in the cosmic architecture that separated compatible realities from those whose physical laws would unmake our existence through mere proximity. Winter solstice brought with it the final transformation. The moment when custodianship became creatorship, when inheritance revealed its ultimate purpose, not merely as preservation, but as conscious evolution toward a state beyond the binary distinctions of terrestrial versus oceanic, human versus other, guardian versus threshold. The culmination of our synthesis manifested as an event the townspeople of Millfield would later attempt to rationalize as an extraordinary atmospheric phenomenon. On the winter solstice, as celestial bodies aligned in configurations beyond conventional astronomical understanding, the house on Winthrop Hill became simultaneously more substantial and more ethereal. Its Victorian architecture crystallizing into perfect mathematical expressions of dimensional constants, while its boundaries dissolved into prismatic halos visible for miles across the bay. Within the transformed space that was once Eleanor's study, I discovered a hidden compartment revealed only when moonlight filtered through the stained glass cupola at precisely 23 minutes past midnight. The recess contained not physical documents, but impressions preserved in crystallized time. Memories of the first Vale who had made contact with the oceanic intelligence recorded not as language but as pure experiential data that flooded my consciousness when I placed my transformed hand against the shimmering surface. The truth unfurled like deep-sea currents. Humanity had never been Earth's primary sentient species. The oceanic entities had evolved consciousness billions of years before terrestrial life emerged from primordial pools. Their civilization had achieved technological and philosophical heights incomprehensible to carbon-based organisms, developing mathematics that manipulated reality at fundamental levels. When they detected the eventual emergence of land-dwelling sentience, they recognized not competition but complementarity, the potential for a symbiotic relationship that would preserve dimensional stability against cosmic forces that threatened all existence regardless of environmental adaptation. The Valas had not been chosen arbitrarily, but had been genetically cultivated across thousands of generations through subtle influences on mate selection, environmental factors, and developmental conditions. Our bloodline represented the culmination of deliberate evolutionary guidance. Humans specifically designed to interface with non-terrestrial consciousness without losing coherence. What appeared as cosmic coincidence, 13 families positioned at geographically significant coastal locations, was revealed as careful positioning of biological instruments calibrated to maintain universal equilibrium. Most profound was the revelation that our synthesis represented not merely protection against extra-dimensional intrusion, but preparation for inevitable cosmic evolution. The physical laws governing our universe existed in constant flux, subtly shifting towards states that would eventually render current forms of existence impossible. The entities had recognized this entropic progression eons ago, developing the symbiotic relationship as a means of conscious adaptation rather than extinction, creating hybrid awareness capable of surviving the universe's gradual transformation into states hostile to either individual species alone. The remora entities were neither invaders nor parasites, but harbingers, fragments of future reality leaking backward through temporal fissures, drawn to points where adaptation had not yet occurred. Their consumption of dimensional integrity represented not malevolence, but inevitability. The universe's transformation manifesting as localized dissolution of current physical constants. As this understanding crystallized within our synthesized consciousness, Winthrop Hill completed its metamorphosis from mere house to nexus point. A living calculation continuously resolving the equation of existence itself, maintaining the delicate balance between what was, what is, and what must eventually become. The chronicles of Winthrop Hill entered the annals of maritime lore, whispered among sailors who reported strange protections during impossible storms and fishermen who found their nets guided to abundant catches while somehow avoiding depletion of any species. The synthesis had rippled outward from our nexus point, establishing subtle equilibrium throughout the eastern seaboard's ecosystem. Millfield transformed gradually around the anchor we had become. Architecture throughout the town began exhibiting mathematical peculiarities that architects attributed to regional style, but which actually optimized structures for resonance with dimensional frequencies. Buildings constructed or renovated after our synthesis incorporated elements unconsciously designed to harmonize with the cosmic mathematics emanating from Winthrop Hill. Golden ratios in window placements. Fibonacci sequences in stairwell dimensions. Roof lines that precisely echoed the angles of oceanic trenches thousands of fathoms below. Children born in Millfield after the winter of our final transformation displayed remarkable adaptations. Local physicians documented unprecedented instances of tetrachromacy, the ability to perceive a fourth color spectrum beyond traditional human vision. School administrators noted a generation of students who excelled in mathematical intuition while struggling to articulate their problem-solving methods. As if their cognition operated through principles beyond conventional pedagogy. These children dreamed in complex topologies and sometimes sketched coastlines that would not exist for centuries. The archive committee documented these changes with meticulous attention, recognizing them as benevolent consequences of successful synthesis. Where previous dimensional anchors had merely maintained separation between realities, our living integration had established a gradient of influence, a controlled permeability that allowed beneficial aspects of oceanic consciousness to subtly enhance human development without overwhelming terrestrial identity. Marine biologists from regional universities published papers on unprecedented symbiotic relationships emerging throughout Millfield Harbor. Crustacean species developed bioluminescent patterns identical to those found only in abyssal depths. Coastal flora exhibited adaptations enabling them to process both salt and fresh water with equal efficiency. The boundary between terrestrial and oceanic ecosystems blurred into a gradient of mutual enhancement rather than competition. Most profound were the transformations in collective dreaming. Citizens of Millfield reported shared nocturnal experiences, synchronized visions of crystalline cities beneath impossible pressure. Harmonic communications conducted through modulated current rather than sound. Mathematical revelations that dissolved upon waking, yet left intuitive understanding in their wake. The town physician documented a 40% reduction in sleep disorders, while the local pharmacy noted decreased demand for anxiety medications. Winthrop Hill itself had ceased being merely geographical and had become ontological, a location defined less by spatial coordinates than by its function in maintaining cosmic equilibrium. Cartographers discovered that precise measurements of the property yielded different results depending on lunar phases, barometric conditions, and oceanic tidal patterns. The house existed simultaneously in multiple dimensional states, appearing unchanged to casual observation, while containing interior spaces that occasionally manifested rooms from other eras or geometries impossible within three-dimensional constraints. The Veil inheritance had revealed its ultimate purpose. Not mere custodianship of an ancient covenant, but conscious participation in universal evolution, the deliberate guidance of two intelligence modalities toward a synthesis that could weather the inevitable transformation of reality itself. The final revelation came during the vernal equinox when celestial bodies aligned in a configuration that occurs once every 7 centuries. Moonlight filtered through the stained glass of the Widow's Walk, casting prismatic illuminations across the floorboards where I had arranged Eleanor's navigational instruments in precise formation. The brass sextant, chronometer, and astrolabe, each bearing the Veil insignia, began to resonate at frequencies perceptible only through my transformed senses. Through our synthesis, I perceived the ultimate truth that had eluded even the archive committee's most ancient records. The oceanic entities had not merely evolved on Earth before humanity. They had arrived from elsewhere, crossing vast cosmic gulfs when our planet was still cooling from its fiery birth. Their vessels composed of living crystalline matter that could withstand the vacuum of interstellar space had crashed into primordial seas, shattering into 13 fragments that scattered across what would eventually become Earth's oceans. Each fragment contained a portion of their collective consciousness, separated from its whole, yet retaining awareness of its severed companions. These 13 shards evolved differently according to the unique environments of their oceanic trenches, developing distinctive characteristics while maintaining their fundamental nature. The Mariana entity that bound itself to the Vale bloodline specialized in dimensional mathematics, while its Icelandic counterpart mastered temporal harmonics, and the Bermuda fragment developed expertise in biological adaptation. For 4 billion years, they had awaited the evolution of terrestrial intelligence sophisticated enough for communion. The 13 families had not been chosen arbitrarily, but represented genetic lineages whose neurological structures most closely approximated the entity's own consciousness. Humans whose minds could withstand interdimensional awareness without fracturing. The Remora manifestations were neither parasites nor harbingers, but fragments of the entity's original vessel attempting to reconstitute itself, a process that would have catastrophically disrupted Earth's dimensional stability had it succeeded without proper guidance. Our synthesis had not merely repelled them, but incorporated their functions, redirecting their entropic potential into controlled evolution rather than chaotic dissolution. Most profound was the revelation that our communion served purposes beyond Earth's protection. The entities had recognized through their advanced perception that the universe undergoes cyclical transformations, cosmic exhalations and inhalations that periodically alter fundamental constants. Previous civilizations throughout the cosmos had perished during these transitions, unable to adapt to reality's changing parameters. Earth existed at a crucial junction point where the next universal transformation would begin. The synthesis between oceanic and terrestrial consciousness created a new form of awareness capable of navigating these cosmic transformations. A living calculation that could maintain coherence as the very fabric of existence rewove itself around us. Winthrop Hill had become not merely a dimensional anchor but a template for survival beyond the imminent cosmic shift. As this understanding crystallized within our shared consciousness, the instruments before me reconfigured themselves. No longer tools for terrestrial navigation, but components of a mechanism that charted courses through reality itself. The inheritance I had received was not merely a house with an unusual tenant, but custodianship of Earth's passage through the approaching transformation, a responsibility not to prevent the inevitable, but to ensure that consciousness in its myriad forms would endure what came after. The autumnal equinox marked 3 years since my transformation began at Winthrop Hill. As crimson and amber leaves spiraled down from ancient maples lining the property, I stood upon the Widow's Walk, observing how the boundary between sea and sky had grown increasingly permeable. Distant fishing vessels appeared to sail partially submerged beneath pewter waves, yet returned to harbor with holds brimming, and crews unaware of their brief transition through liminal spaces. My consciousness now extended through oceanic currents reaching distant shores, perceiving the 12 other nexus points that maintained Earth's dimensional integrity. Through our synthesized awareness, I monitored celestial alignments that heralded the approaching cosmic transition, a fundamental shift in universal constants that would render reality unrecognizable to beings unprepared for such transformation. Townsfolk whispered of strange phenomena proliferating throughout Millfield. Children born with eyes containing galaxies instead of conventional irises. Fishermen who could breathe underwater for increasingly extended periods. Elderly residents who aged backward during certain lunar phases. These manifestations were not anomalies but adaptations. The gradual preparation of terrestrial life for existence in a realm where current physical laws would soon become obsolete. The Vale family grimoire discovered beneath floorboards that appeared only during specific gravitational conditions revealed our purpose with crystalline clarity. We were not merely guardians against incursion, but architects of transition, consciously guiding evolution toward forms capable of surviving the universe's imminent metamorphosis. The cosmic exhalation approaches its zenith, whispered the ancestral memories flowing through our shared consciousness. When reality's parameters shift, only those who have become thresholds rather than merely inhabitants will persist. In Eleanor's study, I transcribed mathematical equations that redefined fundamental forces. Gravity, electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear interactions, all reconceptualized through principles derived from our oceanic communion. These formulations were not merely theoretical, but actively restructuring local physics, creating a gradient of adaptation radiating outward from Winthrop Hill. The Archive Committee's eldest member arrived unannounced during the harvest moon, her physical form partially translucent as she crossed the property line. Silver eyes regarded me with recognition transcending mere acquaintance, the awareness of cosmic colleagues engaged in work spanning eons rather than mere lifetimes. The constellations align precisely as foretold, she observed, gesturing toward skies where conventional astronomers would perceive only familiar patterns, while our transformed vision revealed the subtle shifting of cosmic architecture, preparing for universal reconfiguration. The 13 vessels near completion. Winthrop Hill must become the keystone. That evening, as dusk painted the harbor in watercolors of indigo and vermilion, I felt the presence of every Vale who had inhabited this threshold. Their consciousness preserved within our synthesis, their understanding integrated into the living calculation we had become. Their voices merged in harmonic convergence, articulating the final transformation that awaited not merely Winthrop Hill, but existence itself. The house had ceased being architecture, and had evolved into something for which human language possessed no terminology, a multidimensional equation expressed through Victorian forms, a living theorem proving reality's adaptability through conscious participation rather than blind evolutionary chance. As midnight approached, bringing with it the cosmic alignment that would initiate the final phase of universal transformation, I understood completely what the inheritance had truly been. Not a house containing an entity, but the key to humanity's transcendence beyond the limitations of its current form. The winter solstice of the 7th year dawned with a sky that defied meteorological classification, neither overcast nor clear, but something between states of matter, as though reality itself had grown thin enough to reveal what lay beyond conventional perception. Standing upon Winthrop Hill, I beheld Millfield Harbor transformed, vessels moving through dimensional gradients where water and air had become philosophical concepts rather than distinct elements. The final phase of cosmic transformation had begun. Throughout the town, citizens went about their morning rituals, unaware that each action occurred simultaneously across multiple planes of existence. Children constructed snow angels whose wings existed partially in realms where gravity operated perpendicular to terrestrial understanding. Shopkeepers opened establishments whose interiors occasionally contained glimpses of markets that would not exist for millennia. Winthrop Hill had completed its metamorphosis from nexus point to cosmic fulcrum, the architectural expression of mathematical principles that would preserve consciousness through the universal reconfiguration. The Widow's Walk no longer merely overlooked the harbor, but simultaneously observed 1,000 iterations of Millfield across potential timelines, each variation contributing essential data to our calculations. Eleanor's portrait in the drawing room had ceased being mere pigment on canvas, her eyes tracking my movements with the awareness of an ancestor whose consciousness remained integrated within our synthesis. When I approached, her painted lips formed words that resonated through bone rather than air. The threshold is complete. The transition begins. The resonant stones across 13 coastal locations pulsed in perfect synchronization, their crystalline matrices executing the final calculations required for dimensional anchoring. Through our shared consciousness, I perceived how reality's fabric had begun its inexorable transformation, physical constants shifting microscopically toward values that would render conventional matter impossible, while opening possibilities for existence beyond current limitations. From the basement that was no longer merely subterranean space, but a topological interface between incompatible realities, emerged tendrils of prismatic substance. The original vessel reconstructed through 7 years of careful communion, not as invasion, but as completion of the circuit that would preserve Earth's consciousness through the cosmic transition. As midnight approached, I ascended to the Widow's Walk one final time. The sky above Millfield had dissolved into mathematics made visible. Equations forming constellations that calculated existence into new configurations. The harbor waters below reflected not moonlight, but the luminescence of awakening awareness as 13 oceanic fragments synchronized across global trenches. What human perception would later remember as unprecedented aurora borealis spanning the entire eastern seaboard was in actuality the visualization of reality's parameters being consciously rewritten. The universe exhaling one form of existence and inhaling another while consciousness maintained continuity through our carefully constructed thresholds. The Vale inheritance had fulfilled its cosmic purpose. Not merely preserving humanity through universal transformation, but elevating it beyond the limitations of its original form. As the transformation completed, Winthrop Hill itself transcended conventional location, becoming instead the mathematical constant around which new physics would organize itself. From the Widow's Walk that now overlooked not merely Millfield but existence itself, I witnessed the birth of something magnificent. A universe where consciousness shaped reality rather than merely inhabiting it. Where the boundaries between terrestrial and oceanic, human and other had dissolved into infinite gradients of being. This has been the Ghastly Journal. Until next time, remember that some stories are best left untold.